Great. So, hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us for our first event in the new Integral Altruism speaker series. We're delighted to have you here. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Jonah Wilberg. Jonah is involved with Life Itself, where he runs the research group's weekly meetings, as well as the Second Renaissance London events at Newspeak House. He also blogs about effective and wise altruism, metamodernism, and the Metacrisis on his Substack, The Wider Angle, informed by his background in philosophy. His talk today is about AI governance in the Metacrisis. And just to give you a brief overview of the schedule today, Jonah will talk for around half an hour, followed by some Q&A. Then we will go into breakout rooms for reflections and discussions in small groups. So with that, I will turn it over to Jonah.
Thank you very much, Jack. And yeah, it's an honor to be invited to this first of the series. And yeah, I see a lot of knowledgeable people in the room. I'll be excited to have some feedback and discussion on the talk afterwards. So yeah, this is the title of my talk, Metacrisis and AI Governance. I guess I'll jump straight in with some definitions of like the key terms of that title. So Metacrisis, I expect most of you are familiar with, but you could call it a research field. There's a number of different people who have been discussing the concept recently, which I recently wrote a Substack post about the sort of different perspectives there. And this is all within what's sometimes called the liminal web. Though it has a number of different names. In Second Renaissance, we call it the Second Renaissance ecosystem. And so there are a number of different perspectives on this concept of metacrisis, which I think what they all pretty much have in common is this idea of you have multiple global crises, and this is kind of similar to the polycrisis idea. There you have multiple interacting global crises or catastrophic risks. But B, and this is what defines the metacrisis, as opposed to polycrisis, that all these different global crises have common roots or risk factors. And a key person who talks about this is Daniel Schmachtenberger. I think it's fair to say that he's the most well-known of the people talking about the metacrisis concept. And it's his perspectives I'm going to be mainly talking about today. So that's one side of the sort of two parts of the title. And then the other side is AI governance. Again, most of you will be familiar, in some cases more familiar with than me with this general research field. You could say it's sort of emerged within the effective altruist and AI safety community, which again, sort of interestingly, like the liminal web, is the sort of research community adjacent to traditional academia. So some interesting parallels there. And the focus there, of course, is catastrophic risk from AI. But I guess what distinguishes it from other AI safety research is that you focus on the governance challenges involved in mitigating risk from AI of various kinds. And a key figure there, who I'm going to talk a bit about in some of the later slides, is Alan Defoe, who my sense is he came up with one of the key original research agendas for AI governance at the Future of Life Institute in around 2018. And he's since been a leader in the field, founding the Centre for AI Governance, I believe it's called, something along those lines in London. Now works for Google DeepMind. And yeah, it's kind of interesting that these two fields emerged at around the same time. And what I'm going to try and do in this talk is build a bridge between these two fields, hopefully. And specifically, I'm going to ask the question, what can AI governance research learn from metacrisis theory? We can maybe talk in the discussion afterwards a little bit about how it works the other way around. What can metacrisis theory learn from AI governance research? There maybe be a few suggestions on that along the way. But basically what I'll do is, I guess, yeah, let's start with just breaking down the AI governance field in a bit more detail. So I think this is a fairly standard way of breaking down different areas within AI governance research. So a lot of people write about government policy, the sort of policy-focused research. There's industry-focused research, which I guess would include things like evals, big AI companies. There's field building, which you might say includes advocacy for politicians. And then there's strategy research, which you could say includes these three things. So explaining the nature of AI threats and their impact, and associated with that, setting priorities for governance research. It's obviously linked to what you consider to be the main threats. And more generally, coming up with a conceptual framework that helps us understand how different responses to AI risk fit into a wider perspective, and how to think about the relationship between the different responses we might take. And to me, it's fairly clear that metacrisis theory fits in this general area. It's in this part of AI governance that I think metacrisis theory potentially has something to offer. And that's because it's a quite a high level philosophical perspective. It doesn't tend to go into the details of specific governance actions people might be interested in taking, though it sort of suggests ideas in that area, but it's mainly this very high level picture of human civilization and the risk landscape that we face. And yeah, absolutely happy to share the slides after this. So in terms of the structure of the rest of this talk, I propose to go through these 5 elements of Schmachtenberger's perspective on the metacrisis. So the first 2 are kind of what I've already mentioned, multiple catastrophic threats with an underlying root cause, and specifically the idea of Moloch. It's something here that Schmachtenberger talks about a lot. Then AI as a particularly prominent risk within that global risk landscape. And then 4 and 5, the idea of civilization as a misaligned system, and the need for a third attractor if you consider civilization as a system in that way. And in each case, I'll sort of have a think about, okay, what does the metacrisis perspective on these have to offer the AI governance field? And there are different ways I could have broken down the metacrisis perspective here, and definitely sort of other people other than Schmachtenberger would probably emphasize different things. I guess I've picked these because they seem to me the most relevant in terms of connecting up with AI governance research, as well as being sort of a fairly good characterization of what Schmachtenberger's view is as a whole. Great, so we'll start then with number 1, multiple catastrophic threats. So Schmachtenberger talks about this sort of global risk landscape that includes multiple threats, including AI, but also nuclear, war. He's very concerned about ecological threats, and then there are other risks like pandemics as well. And so is this an original contribution to AI governance research? I think fairly clearly not. It's fairly well known in the AI governance community and the wider effective altruist community that there are these sort of multiple global risks. And in fact, that they interact as well, I think is fairly well accepted. And so a good example of this is Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, where he goes through a number of these existential risks. He sort of, I can't remember how many, but there's quite a lot that he goes through sequentially. And he even has a chapter where he talks about how those risks interact as well. And so I've got a little snippet there at the bottom where he talks about, interestingly, he even goes to the extent of sort of thinking about how there are underlying risk factors that might be worth addressing because they contribute to multiple risks. So I think while this idea is quite well known, I guess what you could say in defense of metacrisis theory is that it does suggest maybe more of a focus on the interconnections between the risks than people tend to do in AI governance and effective altruism in general. So again, Ord's book is kind of an example. Most of the book, to be fair, is a focus on individual risks by themselves and trying to estimate the probabilities and the sort of impact of those risks. And a relatively small part of the book is about their interactions. And so you could imagine a different book that really focuses a lot more on interactions. But on the whole, I'd say this part of the Metacrisis theory is very congruent with governance research, but it's also not really an innovative contribution. Secondly, so this idea of Moloch is obviously not original to Schmachtenberger. He uses the term, which, as most of you probably know, comes from Slate Style Codex post, Scott Alexander, called Meditations on Moloch. And I guess I had a look around at sort of different ways this has been presented, including the way Schmachtenberger presents it. And my sense is that there isn't really a standard way of defining what Moloch is. Actually, everyone defines it slightly differently. So I'm just going to have a go at defining it in the way that seems clearest to me. And this is really in terms of these three main system dynamics, as I think you can think about them. I guess, one thing that they have in common is that they all involve value erosion. So the idea that things that we value get damaged or destroyed by these dynamics. But I think these are sort of three distinct dynamics that all get discussed when talking about Moloch. And an interesting thing about them is that they can all be operating in the same system. And I'll sort of talk through this with an example. So to start with, in the top left, you have probably the simplest dynamic, which is one of perverse incentives. So perverse incentives are normally defined in terms of when people try and achieve a goal through some kind of policy, like giving rewards for, let's say you're trying to get rid of a pest infestation, you give rewards for the number of tails that someone brings you to evidence that a pest has been destroyed. And then you find that, okay, now people have an incentive to farm the pests, like the rats or whatever it is, so that they can cut off the tails and then bring them to you and get the reward. So you've created a perverse incentive there, something that goes against your original idea with the policy. But I guess you can generalize this concept to any system in which people have incentives to do things that are not what people want out of the system. And it makes sense, therefore, to apply this term to things like climate change or nuclear war, or AI, in fact, where people have these massive incentives to invest in these companies, which they will get rewarded for by the market, even though there are these significant risks that result from doing that, which are not basically priced into the market. And there are these externalities, as we call them, that result. So as a result of these incentives, what we get is these technological innovations being very influential in society. So you get particular companies being founded, let's say, and that's what this top left corner represents. Then you get race dynamics. And so what's distinctive here is that not only do you have those incentives that you have in the top left corner, but that the fact that someone else has already created a company or developed a technology means there are now additional incentives for you to engage in the same activity in order to keep up. So in addition to just the benefits of the technology itself, you have the additional benefit of not falling behind the competition. And so that sort of intensifies this trend towards developing these technologies that come with significant risks. And then in the bottom left, I think evolutionary selection is another distinct dynamic where not only do we have incentives in that way, but where people fail to compete effectively against others, they can sometimes actually be eliminated if the competition is fierce enough. So the simple example is companies going bust. They get eliminated from the marketplace. And so that's what those crosses represent. And the result of that dynamic is that the things that you don't want basically replace the rest of the population over time. And that's what we call Moloch winning in that situation. So I guess the point here is just to illustrate that these are sort of three distinct dynamics that can all sort of be operating in the same situation. And I guess just to, I think it's helpful maybe just to think about the original Meditations on Moloch article, and where I think that's a bit confusing. So if you read that article, you'll know that he basically goes through 14 specific cases of what he later calls sort of multipolar traps, or which he thinks are sort of examples of Moloch in action. And he basically suggests that there's this sort of common factor, this basic principle uniting them, as he says, which he calls multipolar traps. And then he goes on in this sort of following sentence to refer to, I guess, some of the dynamics we just talked about, like perverse incentives and the sort of evolutionary process where people can die out if they're not competing effectively. But I think what's confusing about this is that the examples he's given don't actually all have this in common. So if you look at the examples, that there's none of the incentives are things that all the examples have in common. None of the dynamics are actually common to all the examples. So even perverse incentives, which are you could say operating in most of these, probably not really reasonable to say that's operating in the case of cancer, because cancer doesn't have the kind of motivational structure. These cancer cells, it's not that there's no psychology there, so it feels a bit wrong to talk about incentives. What you do have evolutionary selection, and yeah, you could possibly make the same point about agriculture, that that level of Homo sapiens does not really have the same kind of psychology that we have today in talking about these. And then things like sort of race dynamics and evolutionary selection are actually not really present in a lot of the examples he gives. Something like the prisoner's dilemma is such a sort of simple model that it doesn't include some of those more sophisticated dynamics. So this is kind of why my suggestion is that, so instead of thinking about it as being something that's common to all the examples he gives, what we should really be focusing on is that actually some of these examples, like the Malthusian trap story he tells and capitalism, have all these three dynamics operating at the same time. And that's something that's sort of quite interesting about the Moloch story. And yeah, I think it's particularly interesting that capitalism is one of these, because this kind of links to Schmachtenberger's more Marxist-inspired view, I guess, that sort of capitalism is this massive system of perverse incentives and dangerous dynamics. And also interestingly linked to one of the points that Scott Alexander makes in talking about Moloch as a poem, is that it's often interpreted as a poem about capitalism. And so actually there may be something correct in the way that sort of traditional literary scholars have interpreted it. But that, anyway, this is kind of an aside about like why I think it makes sense to interpret Moloch this way, and why it's kind of hard to come up with a good definition of Moloch. Cool. So how does this relate to AI governance? I think we can basically make the same point as we made for the last one, that this set of dynamics is quite well known in AI governance. And in a way that's not surprising, because Meditations on Moloch is quite well known within the sort of rationalist AI safety community. And I think you get actually similar ideas in Bostrom's work that was even earlier than that. In the Superintelligent book, for example, he talks about race dynamics and the importance of considering them in the context of AI safety. Yeah, if you look at some more recent textbooks that I've got some pictures of here on the right hand side on AI governance and AI safety, they include sections on these sort of game theoretic dynamics, including, yeah, I've got a little snippet there on race dynamics. And in general, you can think of a big theme of AI governance research is coming up with policies and ways of coordinating internationally that address these kinds of coordination failures that result from these Moloch dynamics. So I think, yeah, similar story. It's very congruent with AI governance research, but it's not perhaps a sort of innovative contribution there. Okay, next one, AI as prominent threat. Schmachtenberger does think that AI is a sort of particularly prominent threat in the risk landscape, and one of the reasons he gives quite a lot is talking about AI as a general purpose technology. So he thinks that this is sort of quite unusual for technological development. There's only a few really general purpose technologies of this sort. Things like the printing press, perhaps, or information technologies can be general purpose, or things like new energy technologies, things that can really improve processes in a wide range of different areas of society, I suppose is the point. And that includes sort of military use often, as well as use in generating energy for society. And so because of this sort of omni-use aspect of AI, it basically accelerates all the dynamics in society, including these dangerous Moloch dynamics. And that is what gives rise to additional risks then from these technologies. And in particular, it sort of augments the other risks that we might already be worried about, things like environmental risk and things like pandemic risk, if AI can be used to create new pandemic agents. He also talks about the idea of AI as exponential technology. He thinks it's sort of not unique in that respect, because sort of other information technologies also have this property. But it's basically the idea that you have feedback loops where the technology has consequences that in turn make it easier to create that technology. And I guess the obvious example of this in the AI governance space is the idea of recursive self-improvement of AI and intelligence explosion, resulting in potentially superintelligence. So yeah, this is sort of part of the Metacrisis frame for Schmachtenberger as well. And then he emphasizes that AI, when compared to other technologies like nuclear, is relatively easily disseminated. That once the model has been trained, it's quite easy to distribute as a piece of software that can be used potentially by bad agents. And so is this a innovative contribution to AI governance? I think it's the same story. It's already sort of quite well known that AI has these properties. Obviously, people talk quite a lot about the idea of an intelligence explosion, and they're worried about existential risks from superintelligence in the AI governance community. I think there's been an increasing focus, it seems to me, on these near-term risks from AI as well, which can be considered catastrophic or even existential. And yeah, I think it's increasingly recognized that this story about general purpose technologies accelerating existing risks is an important one to take into account. And yes, I've got a little snippet there from the Oxford Handbook of AI governance, which talks about AI as a general purpose technology as a sort of example of that. So again, you could say, yeah, there's maybe a slight shift of emphasis from a Metacrisis perspective, where you broaden out the conception of the risks from just that, from what is sometimes a narrow focus on superintelligence, to these more near-term risks of how AI, just as a general purpose transformative technology, will impact the wider society. Okay, so the next two I'm going to argue are sort of more innovative relative to the AI governance space. But before I get to that, I guess just sort of defining some terms in complexity science, which I think are used by Schmachtenberger in this context. So feedback loops. I've got some diagrams at the top right there, essentially where you have a system that has outputs that are fed back into the system as inputs, and that can be negative feedback, which results in a sort of dampening, stabilizing effect, or it can be positive feedback resulting in runaway dynamics, such as an intelligence explosion. Phase transitions. He sometimes talks about the third attractor as a phase transition in the overall global system. This idea is most commonly defined in terms of systems like thermodynamics of gases, which can have these massive significant phase transitions to liquid or solid states from a gaseous state. Attractors, so he's well known for talking about the third attractor. Attractors can be defined in a number of sort of complex systems, including quite simple ones. And I've given the example at the bottom left there of the logistic map, which is one of the simplest systems that results in attractors. So just a sort of simple equation at the bottom, depending on the value of R in that, can result in attractors, as in points that the value of x gravitates towards and stabilizes at, and that can be sort of more than one sometimes attractor, or it can be a single attractor depending on the value of r. And in much more complex systems, you get similar dynamics where you have a sort of multivariate phase space with these sort of attractor regions that result from the way that the system is built up. These are all, in a sense, examples of emergence, where in general in complex systems we have these sort of emergent dynamics and properties that result from the interaction of a large number of component parts. And then finally, the idea of the autopoietic system being a complex system whose dynamics serve to maintain the system in its existing structure and dynamics. So there are sort of I guess often like negative feedback loops that serve to maintain the structure of the system. And this is related to the idea of life, which is sometimes thought of in terms of this autopoietic process. So biological life, one of the things it does is maintain its structure in this way. Okay, great. So let's move on to number 4. So this is sort of quite a provocative idea of Daniel Schmachtenberger, that the whole of human civilization can be thought of, well, firstly as a system, a complex system. It's quite interesting to sort of think of how like the complexity science and systems theory can apply to that as a system. But not only that, it's a misaligned system, he suggests. And so, misaligned in a similar way to AI is sometimes called misaligned, misaligned to fundamental human values is what we're talking about there. And he also talks about it as this sort of autopoietic system, where as a system that sort of maintains its structure and has these sort of feedback loops that make it difficult to change the structure of the system. So I think this is a really big question of big history, as it is sometimes called. As is the overall trend of civilization one misalignment? Schmachtenberger talks about a lot of sort of examples of this, which I'll just sort of go through. I think there's a fairly good case for this misalignment. So just resource wars, for one thing, throughout history, you might say that some wars are perhaps not misaligned, but resource wars in general are net negatives for civilization, because it's just about ultimately the distribution of resources, and the negative impacts of war are sort of on top of that. Well-being, you can ask serious questions about whether the structures of civilization have been good for human well-being in the long run and at different periods. And a number of people argue that the agricultural revolution was a net reduction of well-being for Homo sapiens. And even in sort of modern industrial civilization, a lot of people talk about a meaning crisis or a sort of well-being crisis today. Inequality, you could say, is evidence of misalignment too, and that's one of the things that we value, is sort of equitable distribution of resources. Ecological damage, he's very concerned about. Technological race dynamics, well, that sort of AI is included in that, and here I guess we're talking about misalignment because of the massive risks that result from the processes resulting in those technologies, as well as nuclear weapons. You could think of those dynamics as generating a high degree of risk that kind of needs to be priced in to the overall assessment of whether it's aligned to human values. And then there's just a sort of historical picture of looking at past civilizations and noting that they have all, except our current one, have actually collapsed as civilizations. And so there's an argument that that's because of their inherent dynamics, that they've been sort of unsustainable in that way. And then I guess his final point is that there's something about the capitalist system in particular, thinking of interest and the way sort of investments in joint stock companies generate interest, and that requires a sort of exponential exploitation of natural resources in order to maintain the flow of interest to the principal. And I guess his point there about it being misaligned is that it's misaligned to the material conditions of that are needed to maintain human life, because exponential growth is incompatible with a finite distribution of resources on the planet that we live on. And so there's a fundamental misalignment there. And the snippet on the right hand side is writing by Schmachtenberger himself on this, sort of in his own words. So yeah, this is, I would say, a perspective on human civilization that is not the mainstream view of AI governance. In that sense, it's potentially an interesting contribution and research area. On the whole, my sense is that the AI governance way of framing things accepts the sort of liberal narrative of progress in civilization. So Holden Karnofsky, for example, accepts, I guess, part of that Metacrisis story. So he's quite well known for talking about. Sorry, 1 second. I've just got someone coming in. My daughter. Okay. Yeah. So Karnofsky talks about how the agricultural revolution resulted in a sort of net decrease in human well-being, but he also does think that modern industrial civilization resulted in a net benefit to human well-being. And I think that's sort of quite a common view, that while people in the space have recognized that there are these massive externalities, it's not that, of course climate change is a thing and there are these misalignments, that the net benefit of civilization is positive, and in that sense you could argue it's not misaligned. So there are interesting questions there, and which I think do have implications for how you think about AI governance. And I guess in practical terms, you could say, well, it's about how much do you trust markets to generate the right kind of AI alignment, for example, and how much intervention in markets is necessary, and how much is part of the solution to AI risk actually systemic change in these economic structures. And yeah, I could give some examples there on the right hand side of, like, it's a recent podcast with Alan Defoe where he kind of seems quite optimistic about the role of the market in solving some of these problems, and he does work for Google DeepMind. So again, sort of indicates that he thinks private companies of that sort have an important role to play in AI governance. And yeah, I guess just to sort of note about the idea of alignment here. So this is linked to the idea of AI being aligned. The question is then alignment to what? And you can talk about the basic sort of control problem, just aligning it to a single user. That's already the sort of massive, difficult technical problem. But of course, it's not the whole of the solution, because it could be just used by a rogue agent. So then you can also think about, is alignment to current norms and institutions enough? And this is where the Metacrisis perspective comes in and says, well, yeah, no, definitely not, because civilization as a whole is not aligned to real human values. So just aligning the AI to our current civilization is also not going to be a solution there. What we need is alignment to real human values. And another way of putting it that Schmachtenberger sometimes uses is it needs to be aligned to the biosphere, again, our sort of material conditions of existence. And I mean, I think this way of thinking about alignment is actually not too far from some existing views in AI governance. So you have this idea of full stack alignment that there's been a recent paper on, which is pretty similar to this, that the importance of looking across the whole civilizational stack when thinking about alignment. And I think even people like Eliezer Yudkowsky would recognize that just aligning it to existing norms and institutions is not sufficient. So he talks about coherent extrapolated volition. You need to think about what people would want in these ideal circumstances when you had sort of much greater knowledge and insight into what you value. Okay, so getting to the final point now. So yeah, Schmachtenberger talks about the third attractor as being the best way of thinking about the response to the meta-crisis. And so this is sort of supposed to be a sort of diagram of like how to define that. So the red line there is the current trajectory of civilization given the current civilizational dynamics. And this leads us to one of two attractor states, neither of which we want. So one of them, the one on the right-hand side, is basically just let Moloch and Moloch dynamics do its thing. And this gets us to this massive uncoordinated space where there's massive risk and quite possibly sort of existential destruction. But then on the other hand, and this could result as an attempt to avoid that uncoordinated space, you could end up with this sort of massive coordination, some kind of massive international organization that then ends up being authoritarian. And yeah, I guess you kind of see that, you know, I think Bostrom wrote a paper about how surveillance may be the only solution to these massive sort of AI risks. And that's kind of what Schmachtenberger has in mind here. So massive surveillance, authoritarian states. So that's the other sort of attractor that we want to avoid here. And so the third attractor is initially defined negatively as what results when we avoid both of those two states, but we still end up with a sustainable civilization. And he thinks it's sort of currently not one of the most likely attractors, and that we actively need to work towards this this transition to make it an attractor in a way that it isn't currently. You can turn those sort of negative characterizations into positives, though, if you think about in each case what you're trying to avoid and what the opposite of that would be. So we know that in order for it not to be attractor one, so we want to avoid Molochian dynamics. So that means we want incentives in our economic system that are aligned to real values. And so this involves internalizing externalities, pricing in the true impact of things like energy production, and solving coordination problems, the sort of massive coordination problems around AI today, so including international coordination. But you not only want to do that, you also want to avoid attractor two. And the way to avoid, you know, the opposite of authoritarianism is essentially democracy. And so he explicitly links this part of the third attractor to the history of thinking about democracy. He points out that some of these sort of earliest theorists of democracy recognized that in order for democracy to work, you need not only the sort of right political institutions, but you need an educated population. And this is why he talks about this idea of cultural enlightenment, that it's not just about institutions, it's about cultural change. And a population that's sufficiently educated on the risks and correct governance to be able to make wise decisions, but in a decentralized, non-authoritarian way. And ideally, it has to be not just that, but it has to be such that it's not capturable by authoritarian systems further down the road as well. So, trying to move a bit closer to then the idea of AI governance again, or AI specifically. I mean, he talks about Schmachtenberger a wide range of things that would contribute towards moving towards the third attractor in different areas, thinking about sort of ecological risk and other risks. I think the bits that are probably most relevant to AI is where he talks about the role of information technology here. And it's worth mentioning that, you know, I think part of a really interesting part of his perspective is that we need to harness existing system dynamics. So you can't be just purely utopian and think, okay, we have this ideal state that we want to get, let's just sort of aim directly for that. You need to use the existing incentive structures, for example, to get you from A to B, and positive feedback loops. And one of those positive feedback loops, I think, is around these exponential technologies. And for Schmachtenberger, that includes AI, but also other information technologies like the internet. And one of the things he mentions quite a lot in his talks is just the role of digital technologies generally in improving governance systems. So he mentions, for example, digital democracy that came out of Taiwan, Audrey Tang, the liminal web itself, this sort of ecosystem of research as being an example of like a good use of information technology through video conferencing tools and podcasting tools. Yeah, he thinks a lot about just educational structures in general. So he's closely aligned with collaborator with Zach Stein, who's written a book on education and the Metacrisis and the role of information technology in improving education systems. And yeah, just generally using information technology to build consensus. Those are some of the things he talks about as sort of practical governance improvements. And so I think, you know, it's a sort of distinctive take relative to the rest of the AI governance space, but it's also quite congruent with it as well. So yeah, it seems to me it's fair to say that AI governance generally does focus on avoiding attractor one. It focuses on those Molochian dynamics and how to coordinate and come up with you know, what we normally call sort of governance models, policies, international organizations, industry standards to address those coordination problems. And perhaps pays less attention to attractor two. So this idea of like, you know, it's really important to avoid the centralized authoritarian government systems and pay more attention in the sort of democratic spirit to the role of the wider population in these governance processes. But there are these sort of interesting links, I think, with recent thinkers in the AI governance space. So Carl Schulman, for example, talks about the importance of AI advisors in a recent interview with Rob Wiblin's podcast, 80,000 Hours. And yeah, I guess you can see on the bottom right there, got little the show notes there include, you know, how does having these AI advisors for everyone like affect culture more generally is part of what's being considered there. And yeah, Alan Defoe is very interested now in the idea of cooperative AI. So using AI, you know, coming up with AI that not only is good at cooperating with other AIs, but that can help humans cooperate with humans and solve these collective action problems in a way that's, you know, potentially very, very decentralized and widespread as well. And it's also, you know, the idea of appealing to the wider population is also, I guess, quite common when you think about attempts to raise awareness generally. So things like Pause AI will try and raise awareness generally in the population. And the fact that Yudkowsky is writing a book aimed at the sort of broader population is another example of this. So I think there are these links, but this is one of those areas where the Metacrisis framing does have a sort of interesting and relatively innovative perspective on the AI governance landscape. So yeah, I think that's the kind of summary. We've got sort of three areas where the Metacrisis perspective is very aligned with existing work in AI governance, but perhaps doesn't really offer anything new. But we've got a couple of perspectives that do offer a relatively innovative area for future research. And I'll stop it there. That's the end. So yeah, really interested to hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Jonah. Yeah, that was a really fascinating talk. Yeah, we have behind time. We have about 10 minutes now for some Q&As. So yeah, if you have a question you'd like to ask Jonah, please use the raise hand option and I will call people out. I think Sean has his hand raised, so go ahead, Sean.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I was trying to clap.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, please just raise your hand. I think that's... I'm getting confused between these hand claps and these hand raises.
I guess I did have an observation on one of the earlier slides. It talked about the sort of dynamics of human values sort of like being lost and how it seems like there's like a commensurability between values such that they can be traded off like that. And like, those mechanisms sort of show up in like how we sort of like advance in like levels of organization. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Are you kind of worried about the problem that like across the whole of global civilization, people will have like very different value systems, and there isn't going to be a sort of like a single value system to align to? Is that kind of what you're pointing to? Or?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, definitely. So like, is there talk about, I guess, like different, like how do we agree on, like different values?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I guess I might point there to the way that Schmachtenberger sometimes points to alignment with not human values, but with the biosphere instead. So I think what he's pointing to there is that there's this sort of naturalistic way of thinking about value as just emerging from our biological status and our need for survival there. Which I think is an interesting way of thinking about it, especially in the context of existential risks, where what you're concerned about is survival. That there's, irrespective of the differences of values everywhere, we kind of all agree that we want to survive. So,
Definitely.
I think we had another question from My Spy, which was, what could be a best way of alternative to CEV? Eliza's CEV. I'm not sure if that is, Jonah. I certainly don't.
Yes, that's the coherent extrapolated volition. Okay. I guess I'm just trying to sort of understand why we need an alternative. You're not happy with that as a theory, but we need some kind of, I guess this links to Sean's question then of like, what's our basic theory of value? Is that kind of what you're getting at there? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm quite feel quite positive about the CEV theory as a theory of value rather than as a theory of like AI alignment. I think something along those lines sort of makes sense to think about. What is human value? Yes, ultimately it does come down to what humans as individual organisms want. That's what sort of grounds statements about value epistemically and metaphysically. That you can't just reduce it to what they want. Currently, there's this sort of process where we learn about values, and that's what the coherent extrapolated volition theory points to. So yeah, that it's a bit like scientific realism and truth about reality as well. We have a scientific process for establishing what makes a theory more true than a previous theory, and so we can't currently characterize what true value is, and we also can't characterize what true reality looks like, but we can point to the process for getting there, and we can say sort of this theory is better than another theory.
Thank you, Jonah. I think as we're a little bit behind time, we might just jump straight into the discussion section now. So I think Jack has got the breakout room set up. Okay. And yeah, so you're going to be assigned a little breakout room with 4 others. And for about